South Korea said on Monday it plans to drop Japan from its white list of countries with a fast-track trade status from September, a tit-for-tat move that deepens a diplomatic and trade rift between the two countries in Northeast Asia. What are the deep roots of this trade issue? Where will this trade war bring to this region? How will the dispute eventually be mollified? To take a quick look at the ongoing trade tensions in Northeast Asia, I'm happy to be joined by Liu Zhiqian, a senior fellow with the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at the Renmin University of China. Sitting in Washington with us is Richard Weiss, a security expert at Wikistrat Global Consultancy. In Hong Kong, joining our discussion is Yoshikazu Kato, Adjunct Associate Professor at Asia Global Institute of the University of Hong Kong. We shall also speak to Professor Robert Kelly at the Department of Political Science of Pusan National University. He is sitting in Pusan. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to Dialogue. Professor Liu, since Japan has decided to remove South Korea from its white list, which followed a decision in July to restrict exports to South Korea of 3 key high-tech materials. This Monday, the ROK decided to respond in kind. What do you make of the prospects of such a serious trade dispute between our two neighboring economies?
Frankly speaking, it's quite a pity for us to know that what is happening between Japan and Korea, because I think the problem happened from the history to the modern time. They have always confused with each other about some major points. Of course, I have to say, frankly, that Japan is the first to take the actions against Korea, that he moved out this Korea from its white list because of some historical problem issues that are not unsolved between the two sides. Of course, we know that Japanese has already explained that it has nothing to do with this historical issue, but this question is very clear and to the whole world. So there's no excuse for such action. So actually, if we find that Korea side has taken retaliation, that also to move Japan out of its own other white list, this is something, a new tension between the two sides. We don't think this is a good trend for both sides. They should find a good solution to solve all these problems. Otherwise, we'll damage the regional situation and also the economic development.
Regarding the assessment of the consequences arising from the current standoff between South Korea and Japan, let me go to Professor Robert Kelly, who's standing by in Pusan. Hello. Robert, what do you make of the role that the United States could play to bring the two allies together in the hope of finding a solution?
The Americans have mediated these kinds of disputes in the past, but I think this time the Trump administration believes that it's best to let Korea and Japan finally work this out on their own. Korea and Japan have been fighting about these historical issues now for 3 decades, and I think the perception is that the United States has played a kind of moral hazard role or insurance role. I mean that the United States, because the United States is always there in the background, maximalists in Korea and Japan can say all kinds of outrageous stuff without any costs, and so the fight just sort of goes on and on and on because both sides go to the Americans as an umpire. And I think that's why now the Americans are not participating, because they want the Koreans and the Japanese to find some kind of final outcome to this dispute.
It's a noble secret, and it comes as no surprise to Robert that very often Washington prefers to adopt the offshore balancing policies with South Korea and Japan being your closest allies, laying the cornerstone for regional security. And allegedly China is described as the enemy of common concern. What do you think of the cohesiveness of your policy in cementing the solidarity between the 3 allies, Washington, Tokyo, and Seoul? Are you suggesting quietly that President Trump has been left embattled and seriously frustrated by domestic politics, and he's so busy with the election preparations for the next year?
Well, I certainly think that Donald Trump doesn't care about allies as much as previous American presidents have, and that helps American opponents in the region, most obviously North Korea. if South Korea and Japan have a really serious falling out, North Korea benefits probably the most, and then China secondarily, but mostly North Korea, I would argue. Trilateral cooperation is difficult right now. It's very possible that South Korea will cancel the military intelligence deal between the two countries. It's called GSOMIA. I don't think the South Koreans will go that far because the Americans don't want it. But the Trump administration is sort of somewhat disengaged from East Asia. Trump himself personally doesn't really care that much, right? The trade war, for example, with China is mostly because of Trump's personal economic beliefs in tariffs, right? He doesn't actually know that much about China. His engagement with North Korea is the same way. He likes being flattered by Kim Jong-un. But if you listen to Trump's speeches, they're very thin on details about North Korea because he doesn't really know very much about it, right? And so I think when it comes to Korea, Japan, the president just doesn't care that much. He just doesn't care. That's why he doesn't talk about it. And so eventually what that means is that the Koreans and the Japanese must sort this out themselves.
But Robert, how serious is the blow, particularly reprisals from the two sides for the industry of semiconductor chips? We know that in this particular area, the ROK boasts of advantages. But how do you assess the consequences of such a trade standoff and the impact upon the economic performance of ROK in particular, since you are standing by in Busan, a major city of ROK?
Sure. Yeah, I think the likelihood is that South Korean producers have several months of stockpiles of the relevant chemicals. There's some dispute about this, right? Maybe there's like a month or 2 months or 3 months. There are all kinds of numbers flying around. Also, the first shipment of the whitelisted chemicals, of the previously whitelisted chemicals, was approved by the Japanese just the other day. And so it looks like the Japanese have put Korea into this sort of special category, the security category. But when the Koreans first applied, the Japanese allowed it to go through, right? It only really matters if the Japanese actually reject a Korean export request, right? And if the Koreans don't have enough supply to get through. My guess is that probably will not happen until November or December, right? And that gives us another 3 months for the two sides to work things out. But if this trade war is still going on at the end of the year, it will become a serious crimp for Korean suppliers, or Korean producers, yes.
Thank you so much, Robert Kelly, for being with us. So let me get over to cross over to a Japanese guest speaker who's standing by in Hong Kong. He is an adjunct associate with the University of Hong Kong, Mr. Yoshikazu Kato. What do you make of the immediate future for both economies, ROK and Japan, given the huge impact of the current trade standoff? Do we follow a similar pattern that's shaped between Washington and Beijing in terms of the trade disputes? What would be the worst case scenario?
I think it's not easy to resolve the current tension between Japan and South Korea, because now it's a kind of more like competitive and based on the very bad emotions and even some anti-Korean, anti-Japanese sentiments between two countries in the public opinion. So this is more than economic competition and some anti-Japanese and South Korean sentiments, and based on some complaints from the business side in the two countries. So I do not think this is going to be resolved very quickly. So it's not going to happen in a couple of months. But because as you know, it's very complicated in terms of historical issues and some historical issues and security issues. Some, for example, some North Korean issues, some complaints from the Japanese side. And now, as American commentators said, the Trump administration's reluctance to engage in these issues in East Asia. So I think now a couple of uncertainties and risks and the lack of driving force to resolve these issues in two allies of the United States. So I am not that optimistic in the future, immediately. Yeah.
Very quickly, Mr. Kato, what was the specific catalyst that has triggered the current tensions? Was it because of comfort women, or the island that's in dispute between the two countries in Northeast Asia? What was it?
It's a great question. I think it's multidimensional, I have to say. Of course, some security concerns, like Japanese government said to South Koreans, products or their business style or something like that. And I would say, a lot of complaints in Japanese business side towards Koreans, products, Koreans, business style. So this is, more like, fundamental. But this is more than that. As you mentioned, comfort women issue. I mean, Japanese government feels now South Korea is destroying and betraying the previous agreement between the two governments. So this is a kind of origin of anti-Korean sentiments in Japan, and actually, particularly supporters of the Abe administration, they support this relatively strong and proactive sanction or countermeasure towards South Korea. So, you're right, what is the trigger? It's a great question, but, it's more like multidimensional from history, from, public opinion, and some, some economic or technical issues. And now, and I think what worries me about is, entire, sentiments and emotion in Japan towards South Korea is getting worse.
Thank you very much. Let me move to Richard
so.
Wise, who's standing by in the D.C. early in the morning, local time. Richard, we know that for a long while the ROK in Japan have been locked up in animosity. They've been on loggerheads for a number of years. But Mr. Kazo put his finger on the issue of anti-Korean sentiment, which allegedly pervade almost all segments of the society for a long while. Do you agree that this remains a chronic issue and a very big problem for Washington to put the two islands together?
I think your previous guest accurately described this as multidimensional. In the backdrop, as you mentioned, you've got historical issues, you've got resentment over the way what historical wrongs, but you also have current divergence over, as you mentioned, territorial disputes, and then there are genuine economic issues. Some of these technologies are very new. We're not sure what the appropriate export controls are, and so on. And none of this is welcome in Washington. And so I think that at some point the Trump administration, if not, probably not the president himself, but the more the people in charge of the Defense Department, State Department, Commerce Department, may assume a more prominent role in trying to resolve the issue.
Thank you so much. Professor Liu, do you think China will be the beneficiary of the current trade standoff between the ROK and Japan? Because the dilemma of Huawei for the issue of 5G telecommunication in the new era. Will ROK end up turning to the Chinese market for much of the compensation that they seek at this moment?
Well, I become the beneficiary from the tension between Japan and Korea, because we have to see the tension between Korea and Japan will damage the supply chain in the whole world. Especially in the communications technologies, it keeps production and supply. There is a long way that with many thousands of different suppliers and customers. The South Korea is not the last customer of the products supplied by Japanese. So this is why that the Japanese and Korea are so concerned about these consequences of this tension between the two countries, because the end user is different. The South Korea will deliver all products to different countries, different customers. Of course, major Chinese customer will also be beneficiary before time, but nowadays I don't think Huawei will be the best beneficiary from the tension.
That's pretty clear, your analysis. But, media in both countries, particularly in Japan, pointed out that obviously ROK is in a weak negotiating position. It's more reliant on the Japanese market and the import of Japanese technology in the semiconductor chips area. But it does come as a surprise, despite the glow of official rhetoric, that sales of Japanese cars in the ROK fell sharply last month. We all know that the South Koreans are very patriotic, madly patriotic, by only buying their own homegrown cars. So this sale, the fall in sales of Japanese automobiles in the South Korea may not deliver a serious impact to the Japanese economy. But what are your thoughts?
But my thinking about this point is that South Korea has also delivered supplied over 1,000 different items to Japan. The Japanese companies, especially for the middle-sized small companies, need a lot of raw materials and semi-products from the south side. So if the tension cannot be solved, I don't think that the Japanese companies will be beneficiary. Of course, from auto industry, from both sides, they will have damages and disaster from each side, especially from Japanese side, because the car selling will be damaged. But in the history, we know that in South Korea, they are not so eager to buy foreign cars, especially they are so patriotic that only use homemade products. So I don't think the Japanese car will have seriously impacted by this tension, but only in the high-tech communications and biotechnology, medical and education, even cultural products will be heavily influenced by these tensions.
Yes, cultural products, particularly drama, television drama and the movies will be seriously undermined as a result. We're discussing the current trade-off, the trade standoff between Japan and the ROK and possible geopolitical fallout in the region. Stay with us, we'll be right back. Welcome back. Let me go back to Richard White. Hi, Richard. What do you think of the geopolitical fallout arising from the current trade standoff between your two allies? In wartime, the highest command is likely to be handed back to the Koreans, but do you think the Japanese, as an ally in the region, will follow instructions? What will be the diversity of the situation in the foreseeable future?
You are quite correct in that if there were to be a contingency on the Korean Peninsula, it would be imperative that the U.S., Japan, and South Korean forces work in harmony. I mean, the U.S. does have forces based in South Korea, but they are dependent on supplies, intelligence, and additional support from the U.S. bases elsewhere, particularly Japan. So far, I haven't seen any evidence that this is impeding those kind of, that kind of preparation. A lot of this is below the radar, so we see these very public disputes over territory, economics, but quietly we're continuing to have meetings between the defense representatives of all countries, the plans, and so on. But certainly this is a worry for the future. So far I don't see a problem, but if it actually reaches that level, then that would be extremely worrisome.
A similar question goes to Mr. Kazu. What do you think of the geopolitical impact?
Of course, in Japan, South Korea is the two allies of the United States, and now we are working on the Japan, China, and ROK, free trade agreement negotiation. So we should be responsible for these very important, geopolitical and strategic issues. But now, our relationship is deteriorated. I think it's a very bad situation. So, this is the first very direct impact in terms of tackling the North Korean denuclearization issue. It's a great impact, a great negative impact for that resolution. So I think this is one impact, and another impact is the integration. Regional integration process would be undermined by the relatively two major powers in this region. So I think in terms of North Korean issue and the regional integration, and how to maintain the basic order and stability in this region, because South Korea and Japan is a relatively big powers in this region. So I think the geopolitical risk shouldn't be neglected.
Do you think Prime Minister Shinzo Abe will move his eyes from the disputed island with ROK and turn to China for the thaw in the bilateral relationship, for a serious rapprochement as a result?
Yes, I think Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has a relatively strong political will to resolve these issues and move on to improve the relation with China. And now, very unfortunately, Trump's administration reluctance to engagement in this region and, worsen the relation with South Korea. So Japan's leadership should be enhanced through improving the relation with China, this biggest trade partner for Japan.
Is this a consensus that's shared by the Democrats, the Liberal Democratic Party, LDP, and other organizations with no party affiliations to seriously improve the bilateral relationship with Japan? Is that a quiet consensus currently in Japan? Mr. Kato?
Yes, I think there is a clear consensus among different parties and intellectuals and public opinion and businessmen. We have great motivation to improve the relation with China. But for Japanese diplomacy, what is the priority? The priority has been always our alliance with the United States. And in terms of strengthening and implementing this alliance, the South Korea should be very important. So we need to take balance between strengthening relationship with China and how to maintain a relatively healthy relation with these allies. Of course, South Korea and Japan is not allies, but we are allies with the United States. So we need to implementing this balancing policy to enhance our leadership and integration of this region. And this is what Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is trying to do now.
We understand the agenda and the considerations of the Abe administration following the success of winning the elections and become the second longest serving Prime Minister in the Japanese history since 1945. But Professor Liu, what do you make of the Japan-China relationship as a result of the animosity between two neighboring countries? I'm talking about the convergence of three heads of state this year to improve regional cooperation, since the United States has started the process of disengagement from the TPP, and the three major economies start talking about RCEP to replace TPP, sort of. But what do you think of the momentum in the process?
I think that this is a good chance or even a good opportunity for China and Japan to improve their relations because of different and fluctuations of the world economy and the world situation. As we know, that the United States has been isolated from the world because of the protectionism and also hegemonism. Even the fight against the Japanese industry or the economy. So I don't think the Japanese are feeling very convenient or very comfortable to deal with the American partner. So this is why also another argument on the ground that for the Japanese government to rethink, to reconsider how to improve the relations with China. Anyhow, China is the second largest economy in the world, and also it's the biggest economy to Japan. So why he should forget to improve the relations with China as such a good neighbor and a partner? So that's why I think that from Japanese side, they are long-lasting side to consider that to improve the relations with China. Of course, from our strategy from China, it's also necessary to get improved the relations with our partner. Japan has its own advantages in technology, innovation, and also in other technology, car industry. Also, we have similar situation, the language in dealing with bilateral relations. So that's why both sides agree that we lay out the historical issues and problems. We are looking forward to the future. So we learn from each other and we support from each other. That's why we can get improved and get our economy strengthened.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me get back to Yoshikazu, who's standing by in Hong Kong. Now, Yoshikazu, the chronic issue of mistrust between Japan and China seems to be diluted somehow by the rapid increase in the number of Chinese tourists who travel to Japan, and they have come back with the good memories about our neighboring country in many, many ways. Having said this, the very issue, the frosty issue of 5G and in its relationship to Huawei would definitely stand in our way of improving relationship. I'm not sure if Japan is one of the members of the Five Eye Alliance, but tell me briefly your policy towards the 5G revitalization, I mean the use of 5G, and what it means for the future in the process of regional integration in East Asia.
Of course, 5G, technologically speaking, this is a good thing, but in terms of business and security concerns, I think Japanese society is relatively conservative, but not less conservative than the United States. But from business side, Japan companies and government is relatively willing to work on that. But it should be very cautious. It should be very.
How do you foresee the prospect of having the parallel world order in terms of 5G or the fifth generation technology?
I think Japanese companies and society, we can accept and we welcome the prevailing 5G technology, and so it's a great investment on next generation. But the problem is how to manage it, right? It's a kind of cybersecurity issue. So we need to coordinate our policies among governments, and we need to welcome our business sides, and we need to please our public opinions. I mean users, consumers, accept to it. So this is a kind of more multidimensional and very complicated process. So
it is complicated indeed for you as an observer based in Hong Kong. But Yoshikazu, other than the issue of mistrust, there is a strong political will and confidence on both sides to seriously consider the start of rapprochement. Small. But what are the other major obstacles that get in the way for our two economies to be closer, as we see the ongoing evacuation of R&D centers from China to other low-income economies in our neighborhood in Asia? Do you think there's also similar move? I mean, there are similar moves by Japanese multinationals to evacuate their R&D from China and remove them to developing countries such as South Asia and ASEAN. What do you think of, say, our efforts to phase out the labor-intensive manufacturing industry? It's not just our own efforts. It's also a collective spirit by multinationals to phase out their reliance on the low-value-added, labor-intensive manufacturing in China that has boosted actually our economic expansion over the past 3 decades. What do you think of the immediate future?
Now Japanese 4 decades lasting official development assistance to China has ended last year. So now Shinzo Abe, our Prime Minister, emphasized Japan-China economic relations entering a new stage, and emphasized the cooperation in the third companies. So this is kind of internationalized Japan-China economic ties. So I think this is something different from previous dates. So this is a process for Japanese citizens to adapt and to this new era. And I think now our businessman and public opinion, we have relatively open-minded to work with China and internationalize our new relationship. So I think this is a good time to talk about what would and what should the new Japan-China relationship should be. And I think obviously economy is the most future-driven and future-oriented factor for Japan-China relationship.
Thank you so much, Professor Liu Zhiqin. Thank you, Mr. Yoshikazu Kato, and thank you, Mr. Richard Weiss, for being with us. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.